February 24, 1944, Berlin, late morning. The ceiling is a dirty lid of cloud and exhaust, the air thin and metallic with cold. Sirens yowl across Tempelhof as mechanics kick chocks, and the first Bf-109Gs nose into the grey. From the west come the silver pinpricks they know too well, the tall square tails of B-17s and the slimmer B-24s droning in box formations that make the streets tremble. A staffel climbs to meet them, expecting the ritual slash through the bombers, then dive away before the American escorts can catch up. But today something moves inside the haze that does not belong to the old rhythm. Sleek shapes hang impossibly high, then fall like thrown knives. The first passes are not the heavy, wheezing turns of thunderbolts, nor the long telegraphed climbs of lightnings. These fighters, Mustangs, hit, climb, and are still there when the Messerschmitts try to run. A German pilot later wrote that the new enemy seemed to carry their own sky with them. He numbers his ammunition, counts his seconds in a dive, and still, when he levels out, the same narrow wings hold his canopy in their glass. With 108-gallon paper tanks jettisoned, the P-51’s keep pace well beyond the city ring. Their Packard-built Merlins smooth at high altitude, their range stretching the battle eastward until German fuel gauges swing toward empty. Franz Stiegler, who has escaped before by outclimbing or outdiving, finds only a mirror at his shoulder and the slow panic of time running out. In a flak-washed sky meant to protect Berlin, the hunters discover they are outflown, not just over the target, but all the way home. What the Luftwaffe cannot see from their cockpits is the hinge on which this day turned, years earlier and an ocean away. A test flight gone wrong in the California desert exposed the secret that would make the Mustang a true long-range escort. That story begins in 1942, in a hangar that smelled of hot oil and dust. By late 1942, the air war over Europe had become a slaughterhouse of aluminum and flame. Each morning, crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, knowing that a quarter of them might never come back. The bombers rose from England's damp airfields in glittering columns, bound for targets like Bremen, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Inside the formations, men sat in freezing, oxygen-thin air for hours, gripping 50-caliber guns while watching the contrails of enemy fighters closing in. Beyond the Rhine, their escorts always turned home. The P-47 Thunderbolt, rugged, powerful but gluttonous for fuel, could barely reach the German border before its tanks ran dry. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning went farther, but its Allison engines lost reliability in the cold, thin altitudes over central Germany. That left hundreds of bombers exposed, flying unguarded straight into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. The results were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, in the twin strikes against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 376 bombers went out. 60 never returned. Nearly 600 airmen were lost in a single day. Their formations torn apart by waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s. Gunners fired until their barrels melted, watching friends vanish in blossoms of black smoke. At that rate, the U.S. daylight bombing campaign would burn through men faster than new crews could be trained. The British Royal Air Force, having learned the same lesson earlier, had switched to night bombing to hide from German interceptors. But the Americans, under Generals Ira Eaker and Karl Spaatz, refused to abandon daylight precision raids. They believed the war could be shortened only by destroying Germany's industrial heart, factories, refineries, and ball-bearing plants, one daylight strike at a time. The problem was simple, brutal, and unsolved. No fighter in the Allied infantry could escort bombers to Berlin and back. The Air Technical Service Command began testing prototypes that could, searching for a design aerodynamic enough to sip fuel and swift enough to duel the Luftwaffe's best. Across the Atlantic, one candidate was quietly proving itself in RAF service, the North American Mustang MKY's Sleek. Fast and armed with 50-caliber Brownings, it was impressive but not yet remarkable. No one suspected that the key to unlocking its potential would appear after a near-fatal crash in the California desert, a crash that would reveal not just a weakness, but the hidden genius within its design. April 10, 1942, Muroc Army Airfield, a flat, sun-blasted stretch of desert in Southern California. The wind smells of sand and oil. On the runway, a lone test aircraft idles, its nose pointed toward the shimmering horizon. Test pilot Robert Chilton, a 29-year-old former Army Air Corps flyer, straps into the narrow cockpit of an experimental North American fighter. Beneath him rumbles the Allison V1710 engine, a liquid-cooled V12 that promises high speed, but only close to the ground. The Mustang, as it's been named, slices through the desert air at over 350 miles per hour at low altitude. Yet above 15,000 feet, the Allison gasps for air, its single-stage supercharger starving the cylinders of oxygen. That morning, Chilton's orders are simple. Climb higher, push the limits, and see just how far the Allison can go before it quits. At 20,000 feet, the answer arrives violently. The coolant temperature surges past redline. A thin stream of glycol vapor traces along the fuselage, then bursts into a mist. The propeller begins to seize. Chilton cuts the throttle and banks toward the sandflats, hunting for a place to set down. The Mustang hits the desert floor in a sliding impact that shears off its landing gear, kicking up a tail of dust and smoke. When the dust clears, Chilton crawls out dazed but alive. The prototype, twisted and smoking, has one strange quality. It's still largely intact. When North American engineers examined the wreckage, they found something unexpected. The Laminar flow wings, an innovative design meant to reduce drag by maintaining smooth airflow, had barely warped. The soot streaks on the aluminum skin traced elegant symmetrical lines from the leading edge to the tail, showing that airflow had remained stable even during the uncontrolled descent. The Mustang's shape, it turned out, was almost perfect. The problem wasn't the airframe, it was the Allison engine, which simply couldn't breathe at altitude. Chilton's crash report reached both the British Air Ministry and Rolls-Royce engineers, who immediately recognized an opportunity. What if they replaced the Allison with their own Merlin 61, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire Memca 9? On paper, it was a marriage of opposites: American airframe efficiency paired with British altitude power. North American's team began sketching the conversion even before formal approval arrived. From the wreckage on that desert floor emerged the seed of one of aviation's most unlikely successes, a transatlantic fusion that would soon give the Allies the fighter they'd been desperate for. The next challenge would be to prove that the hybrid Mustang could fly and survive where no other escort could. October 1942, Hucknall Aerodrome, Nottinghamshire. The English autumn lay heavy over the airfield, damp and cold, the smell of wet grass mixing with aviation fuel. Inside one of Rolls-Royce's hangars, engineers gathered around a gleaming hybrid creation that looked familiar yet alien. A North American Mustang airframe mated to a Merlin 65 engine. The mechanics called it an experiment. Test pilot Ronald Harker called it a gamble. The Mustang had always looked fast. Its laminar flow wings, narrow fuselage, and deep radiator scoop hinted at speed, but its Allison engine had strangled it above 15,000 feet. Now with the Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the aircraft promised to breathe freely in the thin air where bomber formations lived and died. On its first test flight, the transformation was immediate. As Harker lifted the nose through the cloud base, the altimeter climbed past 25,000 feet, without the usual drop in power. The Mustang Merlin hybrid accelerated effortlessly, reaching over 430 miles per hour, nearly 100 faster than before. Its rate of climb rivaled the Spitfire, yet its range stretched nearly twice as far. Rolls-Royce engineers confirmed what the airflow tests from Chilton's crash had hinted at. The Mustang's frame was so aerodynamically efficient that it turned excess engine heat into thrust through a phenomenon now known as the Meredith effect. Every ounce of drag was repaid in speed. When word of Hucknall's success reached Washington, the U.S. Army Air Forces and North American Aviation moved fast. The Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit secured a license to produce the Merlin in America under the designation Packard. V1653. Engineers in California refined the cooling system and mounted external drop tanks beneath the wings, slim metal pods carrying enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a range of nearly 1,500 miles. For the first time, an escort fighter could match the endurance of the bombers it protected without sacrificing speed or maneuverability. By early 1943, the Mustang had become more than an experiment. It was an answer. The prototype XP-51B would soon enter production, its lineage half British, half American. But before the Merlin Mustang could claim the skies over Europe, it would earn its reputation under the Mediterranean sun against the Luftwaffe in Italy. December 1943, Foggia, southern Italy. The airfield sits in a sea of winter mud, bomb craters patched with planks, the air thick with the tang of gasoline and cordite. Rows of olive-drab Mustangs gleam faintly in the weak sunlight, their new Merlin engines coughing to life in sequence. For the men of the US 31st and 52nd Fighter Groups, this marks a turning point. They've traded their trusted Spitfires for something unproven, the P-51B Mustang, fresh from the factories and still smelling of paint and oil. Their mission that morning is to escort B-24 Liberators north toward Rome and the Po Valley, rail yards, aircraft factories and oil depots that feed the German front. As the bombers climb out of Bari and form their shimmering columns, the Mustangs slip above and behind them, climbing higher and higher. In the thin air over the Apennines, where Spitfires once faltered, the Mustangs surge ahead with power to spare. Lieutenant Edward McComas later wrote that it felt like flying a knife through silk. German radar stations near Bologna catch the blips early and scramble. Jagdgeschwader 53, JG-53 Packard-built, the ace of spades group that has long dominated these skies. But when their Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs arrive to intercept, they find something they've never seen before. The American escorts do not turn back at the usual limit. They keep coming, high, fast, and still accelerating. Luftwaffe pilots report shock and confusion. One combat diary describes a chase where the enemy followed beyond our expected fuel limit. Another notes, Phyllis aircraft climbed as ours began to gasp. The P-51's dive with astonishing control, roll out and climb again to rejoin the bombers. Maneuvers impossible for Thunderbolts or Lightnings. For the first time, German pilots realize there is no sanctuary, no altitude beyond Allied reach. By January 1944, intelligence summaries in Berlin warn of a new Anglo-American fighter capable of operating beyond expected radius. The reports sound almost disbelieving. But in the mess tents of Foggia and Bari, the pilots already know the experiment has worked. The Mustang can protect bombers deep over Axis territory and still fight its way home. Word of its success races north to England, where commanders of the 8th Air Force demand the aircraft at once. The next test will not be over Italy's rolling hills, but over the factories and cities of the Reich itself. December 1st, 1943, Boxted Airfield. Kesix. Frost clings to the grass, and the North Sea wind cuts through the revetments where ground crews cluster around a new arrival. The olive-drab fighters bear a foreign smell of factory lacquer and Atlantic salt. They are the first P-51B Mustangs to reach England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, a 9th Air Force unit lent to the 8th for bomber escort. Their Packard-built Merlin engines rumble with a lower, silkier tone than any Allison before them. To the pilots who have flown Thunderbolts and Lightnings, they look impossibly sleek, too delicate for the brutal air battles over Germany. Within weeks, those doubts vanish. On January 4, 1944, the 354th flies its first deep escort mission, B-17s bound for Kiel, a 700-mile round trip across the frozen North Sea. It is the kind of operation that once cost dozens of bombers. That day, not one falls to enemy fighters. The Mustangs hold with the formations all the way to the target, then turn back over Denmark, still with fuel to spare. Their range and speed change everything. No longer bound to defensive circles around the bombers, the P-51s begin fighter sweeps, surging ahead to intercept Luftwaffe formations before they can reach the bombers. German radio chatter reports confusion, enemy fighters appearing miles ahead of schedule, high above expected altitude. By February, Mustangs are escorting raids to Frankfurt, Leipzig, and even the outskirts of Berlin. German ace Hermann Graf, grounded by this time but still influential in Luftwaffe training, is said to have called them predators waiting at the gate. It was no longer the Americans waiting for ambush. The hunters had become the hunted. Mustang squadrons, now carrying 108-gallon paper drop tanks, could outfly and outlast any German interceptor. On the return leg, pilots began attacking airfields, strafing runways, fuel depots, and parked aircraft. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe's defensive heartland came under direct assault from its own skies. The shift was more than tactical. It was psychological. For years, the German fighter force had fought within reach of its bases, certain that the bombers' escorts would always turn back before crossing deep into the Reich. Now, the Mustangs didn't turn back. They chased, hunted, and harried across Germany's industrial core. The Luftwaffe, once master of the European sky, began to feel the walls closing in. The great air battles of 1944 were about to begin, and this time the fight would be on the Allies' terms. Spring 1944, Western Germany. The once proud Jagdgeschwader that had ruled Europe's skies now waited on cracked runways, engines idling, while fuel trucks sputtered dry. In briefing huts, young pilots listened to veterans describe an enemy they could scarcely believe existed. Reports spoke of American fighters that climbed with the bombers, fought over Berlin, and somehow followed them all the way back to England. For Luftwaffe pilots trained around the Bf-109's limited 370-mile range, such endurance defied logic. Josef Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlageter, wrote bitterly in his logbook, "The Americans have a devil's machine that never runs out of fuel." At first, intelligence officers at the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, refused to accept these claims. They assumed the Allies must have built forward airstrips somewhere in occupied France or Belgium, or perhaps were staging from secret bases in the Channel Islands. Reconnaissance flights were dispatched to confirm this theory, but the photographs returned empty. The bombers and their escorts were still coming from England and returning there unrefueled. When this realization spread through Luftwaffe headquarters, it triggered something close to panic. If the Allies could now send fighters deep into the Reich, every factory, fuel dump and airfield lay exposed. Captured P-51’s, examined at Rechlin Test Center, revealed the truth. German engineers were astonished at the aircraft's simplicity, its laminar flow wings, light airframe, and clever drop tank fittings. The Packard-built Merlin engine ran smoother and cooler than their own Daimler-Benz 605s, consuming fuel with astonishing efficiency. The technical advantage was undeniable, but the psychological blow was even greater. As the Allied air campaign intensified, the Luftwaffe's ability to respond collapsed under the strain. Jet projects like the Me-262 and the high-altitude T-152 promised salvation on paper, but arrived too late and in too few numbers. Meanwhile, chronic fuel shortages cut pilot training hours to a fraction of what they had been in 1940. The once formidable Jagdwaffe was left with exhausted veterans and terrified novices. For them, every takeoff began under the same grim expectation that somewhere, invisible against the sun, a P-51 was already waiting. By mid-1944, America's industrial might had turned the Mustang from a daring prototype into a weapon of mass production. At North American Aviation's vast plants in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, the assembly lines roared day and night, stamping and riveting aluminum skins under the glare of arc lamps. The smell of hot oil and lacquer filled the air as rows of half-finished fuselages crept forward on moving jigs. Every hour another P-51 rolled off the line, its olive-drab panels still warm from the paint ovens. By summer, the two factories together were producing more than 300 Mustangs each month, and by the war's end, over 15,000 would take flight, a logistical feat that mirrored the aircraft's own efficiency. In Detroit, the Packard Motor Car Company had been transformed from a luxury car builder into a powerhouse of aviation engineering. Thousands of skilled machinists and newly trained women, mechanics turned out Merlin engines under the American designation V1653. Each engine endured a brutal endurance test before shipment. 12 hours of full power running, followed by disassembly and inspection. Once certified, the engines were crated, sealed, and sent by rail to assembly plants or East Coast ports, where Liberty ships carried them across the Atlantic to England. The Mustang's long reach depended on equally precise supply coordination. The U.S. Army Air Force's standardized fuel systems for auxiliary tanks, first the 75-gallon metal type, then the lightweight 108-gallon paper tanks made of resin-impregnated pulp, designed for one-way missions. Logistics officers perfected a rhythm. Wings, fuselages and engines shipped separately, then reassembled in British depots so entire fighter groups could be re-equipped within weeks. Even the Royal Air Force adopted the improved P-51B and C models as the Mustang III, deploying them for reconnaissance and long-range escort. This seamless partnership of American industry and British innovation did more than build airplanes. It built endurance. While German factories struggled under constant bombing and dwindling fuel, Allied production surged forward, unstoppable. And as the factories hummed across the Atlantic, thousands of brand-new Mustangs gathered on English airfields, their engines eager for the next great test, the skies over Normandy. June 6, 1944, dawn over the English Channel. The sky is alive with wings. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs roar eastward above the dark water, their silver bellies flashing in the early light. Beneath them, the sea boils with invasion craft, thousands of ships carrying the greatest armada in history toward the beaches of Normandy. For months, the Mustang has escorted bombers deep into Germany. Now its role has shifted. This morning, its task is to protect the invasion itself, to sweep the skies above Caen, Cherbourg, and the Cotentin Peninsula clear of German aircraft before they can strike the landing convoys. Flying from bases across southern England, the P-51s cross into France at first light. They've traveled nearly 250 miles just to reach the coast, distances that would have been impossible for earlier escorts. Yet the Mustangs still have fuel to fight. At 20,000 feet, they orbit the invasion beaches, scanning for the dark silhouettes of W190s or Bf109s. German pilots scrambled from airfields near Évreux and Rennes are stunned to find the Americans already waiting for them. Luftwaffe reports describe enemy pursuit fighters present even over the invasion front, something no German strategist had thought possible. For the next 72 hours, the Mustangs dominate the air. They pounce on enemy aircraft before they can approach the beaches, then dive low to strafe trains, trucks and fuel convoys across northern France. Bridges collapse, rail lines twist in black smoke, and the movement of German reserves slows to a crawl. Luftwaffe survivors later recalled the feeling of being hunted from the moment we took off. The Mustang's endurance turns it from an escort into a weapon of pursuit, able to chase retreating forces across the continent, cutting them off wherever they regroup. By the time Allied armies break out of Normandy in July, German air power in the west has been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The road now leads east, into the skies above the Reich. March 1944. Clouds over northern Germany burn white in the cold sun. The 8th Air Force has launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. For 7 relentless days, the sky becomes a battlefield of machines. From bases in East Anglia, waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rise in formation, bound for the heart of Hitler's industrial empire. Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg and Berlin itself. For the first time, P-51 Mustangs fly alongside them all the way in. Their Packard Merlins hum steadily at 30,000 feet, drop tanks emptying as they cross the Rhine, but still with power to spare. It is a mission once considered suicidal. Over 10,000 sorties thunder into the Reich that week. German radar operators watch in disbelief as escorts remain with the bombers past every expected turning point. The Luftwaffe throws everything it has, Bf109s from JG-1, FW190s from JG-11, even night fighters pressed into daytime service, but the results are catastrophic. Mustang squadrons sweep ahead of the bomber columns, pouncing on interceptors before they can form up. Others break away on the return leg, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and torching fuel depots. By week's end, the Luftwaffe has lost nearly 600 fighters and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. Big Week shatters not just German production capacity, but the illusion that the Reich's skies could ever be defended again. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, the Mustangs extend their reach further still, escorting bombers to the synthetic oil refineries at Laminar and Pulitz, cutting the arteries of the German war machine. Pilots begin calling their mounts the long arm of the 8th. To the Germans, they are Terrorflieger, not for brutality, but for omnipresence. Even the arrival of the Me-262 jet cannot stem the tide. Mustangs strike jets during takeoff and landing, exploiting their brief moments of weakness. From the wreck of Chilton's desert crash had risen an aircraft that now reached every corner of Hitler's empire. Yet even victory brought its own burden. For the men who flew the Mustang, the war was far from over, and the cost of dominance was still to be paid. Winter 1944, frost clings to the metal skins of parked Mustangs along muddy English airfields. Beneath their beauty lay fragility. The P-51's liquid-cooled Merlin engine, the heart of its speed and range, was also its greatest weakness. A single rifle bullet that punctured the coolant system could spell instant death for both machine and pilot. Without glycol, the engine seized within minutes, forcing flyers to bail out over hostile territory or the icy channel below. The rugged Thunderbolt could limp home trailing smoke. The Mustang often could not. Cold weather brought new challenges. During missions over Germany's industrial valleys, temperatures at 25,000 feet plunged below 40°. Fuel lines feeding the paper drop tanks froze solid, cutting off vital range. Crews tried heating them with improvised wraps or covering joints in engine oil, but malfunctions persisted. Inside the cockpit, pilots endured hours of numb hands and aching legs in what many described as a coffin made of glass and metal. Rearward visibility remained poor, forcing constant scanning of mirrors and instruments. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared out of the sun, survival depended on reflexes measured in seconds. Even with its refinements, the cost of mastery was high. More than 2,500 Mustangs were lost in the European theater alone. Mechanical failures, flak, and the unforgiving precision of aerial combat. Yet compared to the dark days before its arrival, the change was revolutionary. Bomber losses that had once reached 20 to 25% per mission now fell below 5%. The Mustang had transformed air warfare from attrition into dominance. Engineers and pilots alike pressed for improvement. The P-51D appeared with a new bubble canopy for all-around vision, and 650 caliber Brownings bristling from its wings. Each revision made it faster, tougher, and deadlier, but never invincible. Its perfection was not a gift of design alone, but the result of constant adaptation, each innovation written in fuel, metal, and blood. From one test pilot's crash in the desert had come an aircraft that redefined victory, at a price paid in the thin air between triumph and loss. By early 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become the unmistakable emblem of Allied mastery in the air. Its long legs and high-altitude power had done what years of attrition could not, brought the Luftwaffe to its knees. The Mustang's constant presence over the Reich made German industry's final collapse inevitable. Rail lines lay twisted, fuel convoys burned, and factories stood silent under relentless attack. Former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland would later admit that the Mustang broke the back of our fighter arm. The German pilots who survived spoke of exhaustion and inevitability. No matter how far they flew, the Americans were there first, waiting in the sunlight. To the Allies, the aircraft represented more than victory. It symbolized a revolution in thinking. Never again would bombers fly unescorted or range be treated as an afterthought. The Mustang proved that speed and agility meant little if a fighter could not reach the battle and stay there. Its success reshaped doctrine in every air force that studied it, influencing designs from the post-war jet age onward. It also stood as a testament to cooperation. American manufacturing precision had fused with British engine genius to create something greater than either nation could have achieved alone. After the war, Mustangs served in the air forces of over 50 countries and flew again in the Korean War, still agile, still deadly. But their greatest triumph had already been won, not merely in combat, but in the idea they embodied. What began with a single crash in the California desert became the story of ingenuity transforming defeat into dominance. From Robert Chilton's wrecked prototype rose the fighter that turned the tide of the air war and proved that innovation, once airborne, can change the course of history.